So thank you very much for having me at this conference. As Julian mentioned, we've done a lot of open data over the years, so I'm just going to share a little bit about our journey there. So start with who are TfL and what do we do? So it might go without saying for quite a lot of you, and some of you might be feeling like we haven't helped you out on your day to day with the strikes that are going on across the UK and in London. But we're London's Transport Authority, and so we are responsible for most of the modes of transport as you travel around the capital. And that's ones that you would kind of go without saying, say like the tube, the overground, and some of you may be aware of the Elizabeth line that launched a couple of weeks ago. But we also have responsibility for the road network. So we run the congestion charging and the ULEZ scheme on behalf of the Mayor of London. And we have a big focus on active travel, so encouraging people to walk and cycle. So we really do cross over with the whole of London, not just people who are getting the tube to work. I should have also probably mentioned the small matter of buses, which is actually our biggest used mode. So we help move a lot of people around London. So before the pandemic, we were running around 31 million journeys per day were made in the capital. Obviously that took a massive hit during lockdown, but what we are seeing is that ridership is now recovering from the pandemic. And the latest stats I got last week were that we're getting around 3 million tube journeys every weekday, which is about 75% of the demand that we were running at before the pandemic. And actually it goes up more at the weekends, so where we're more like 85 to 90% of demand. So what's that showing, and it's perhaps meets some people's experiences personally, is that people are returning to their leisure life. So they're traveling at weekends, they're going shopping, they're entertaining. But the work from home looks like it's a trend that's here to stay, and that's obviously affecting the number of journeys that we get in the week. So what we don't know is how that's going to normalise in the sort of longer term. And then bus, as I said, is actually got more journeys per day than the tube. We're running at about 5 million bus journeys each weekday, which is about 80% of what we're running at the pre-pandemic. So I'm in the digital team, and I'm on the senior product manager there. We're responsible for what we call the customer-facing digital experiences, digital touchpoints, which is a little bit of a mouthful, but basically means it's the TfL website, it's the apps that we run, and it's the digital screens that you see in stations. And we also manage the data and the kind of underlying services that that drive those customer-facing products, and that's what one of the things I look after is what we call digital platform. So it's bringing all that together, and part of that is open data. So obviously what we're here to talk about today is the open data service that we produce, and that's one of my responsibilities. So worth starting, I think, by what we mean at TfL when we say open data. And we release a lot of data to the public, and doesn't all come under that kind of open data umbrella. What we think of as TfL open data, or we kind of almost put internally anyway, a little sort of product brand on it of TfL Open, is the data. It's mostly operational data that we release, that we allow developers to use, that we're kind of expecting to be used for delivering customer-facing experiences, basically. So it includes things like the timetable data and the live arrivals, and it's about getting messages out to the customer. But we also release an awful lot of transparency data, some of which is driven by freedom of information requests, but it's also just about us being really transparent about things like the services we provide and what we spend people's money on, obviously a public service. And that's available publicly, but it doesn't come under what I'm going to talk about today. So our open data kind of falls into two types. So we've got what we call the unified API, which, as it sounds like, is a way of bringing together all of the sort of real-time feeds and the data that we'd expect to come in high volumes and high sort of frequency of update. So things like the timetables, the arrival and departure information, any sort of status or disruption information that we get. We've got 19 unified API endpoints currently. And then we also have a bunch of sort of static data sets, which is more kind of the kind of data that we wouldn't expect to be updating on like a daily basis. And we've got 7 themed buckets, which have multiple data sets in them. And that covers things like the cycling infrastructure data, which explains what we have out on, on the network, but obviously isn't something that changes on a daily basis. And our open data is really big. So in 2021, despite the pandemic and the fact that fewer people were traveling, so people were obviously using the digital services that provide customer information less, we still had over 6 billion requests, averaging 17 million per day. And actually at its peak, once lockdown kind of eased and people started traveling more, we were getting 30 million daily requests. And it's worth saying that that doesn't sort of give us the whole story, because obviously services will aggregate data, they will take our data and cache it. So it's not that 6.1 million customers accessed it, that's just the hits on our server. I think a really key point about our open data is that it's serving internal products as well as third-party ones. So, yeah, I think probably people would know that the open data, to get transit information around London, it's our data that's serving a lot of the kind of key apps that you'd have in the marketplace, as well as a lot of smaller ones. But it's also the same data that serves our internal products. So as I mentioned, the TfL website, the apps that we run, and the digital screens. We support a fairly large developer community. Last time I asked for an update on this, which was in April, we had around 10,000 users of the API, Universal API registered, and that showed that we added 1,500 people in 2021, so it does sort of tick up. And every so often we kind of have a little, a bit of housekeeping and kind of clear out people that aren't using it for sort of data, sort of privacy reasons. So it has been higher in the past, and then it comes down and it goes up again. And we have a tech forum that is one of the main ways that we reach the developer community. So we obviously post that information, and we also get questions coming in and feedback coming in that way. And we've currently got around 600 users registered for that. And there's a fair amount of activity each day. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about a report that's a few years old now, but we talk a lot about the value of open data, and we're very committed to it, as I think I'm going to say later on in this presentation. But it's quite hard to quantify the value of it. So obviously we invest money in our open data service, and we're providing kind of customer benefits, but it's hard to know how much that was. So back in 2017, we commissioned Deloitte to look into what that benefit could be. And it came back with a estimated figure of value worth £130 million a year. That's to TfL ourselves, to London as a city, and to travellers in terms of the kind of time that they save and the activity there. I have no idea if that's an accurate figure. It's only ever an estimate. And obviously the world has changed quite significantly since 2017. But I think what's really nice is the quote that I kind of pulled out about it being a virtuous circle, benefiting people that are using the network and people that are delivering it. So it helps us, and it helps our users, and it helps the community. So yeah, I think that kind of goes without saying that we are committed to our open data. And a quote I pulled out from that same report was from Vernon Everett, who was really much, he was the sort of driving force behind the creation of the open data service. He left TfL just after Christmas this year. But our guiding principle is to make all non-personal data openly available unless there's a commercial, technical or legal reasons why we should not do so. So it's really saying that the kind of default position is that we will make it open. And we have to have a reason to. So as the title of this presentation is, we also obviously do a lot of product development in-house, and I really think that the product development that we do and the open data that we publish really do complement each other and work. So I wanted to start with a little bit of a brief history of our open data at TfL. And you can see that we started publishing some data sets way back in 2009, which I should say is way before I was at TfL. And we've sort of steadily added to that. And some kind of really key bits are the release of the Unified API back in 2014, the Journey Planner actually in 2011, and then the step-free data that we published, well, initially in 2020 and then updated in 2021. And I think it's worth pointing out that Our open data and our product development roadmap are sort of intrinsically linked. And most of the major times that we've released new data into the community, it's coincided with it being on our roadmap to do for our internal products as well. So that was the sort of original TfL website. The unified API was at the cornerstone of what was then the new website back in 2014, 2015, and really had a change in terms of the approach to how we fed the data that we provided to both our internal products and the third parties. And then TfL Go, which is the app that I'm going to talk about a bit more later on, launched in 2020. And that was really the driving force behind both the step-free access data accessibility and station busyness API, which I'm also going to talk about later. So it really just shows that our open data and our product development really do go hand in hand. And I think I alluded to this earlier, so spoiler alert. A really key part to that is the fact that we're using the same data in our own products as we release to as open data. So we're not kind of hiving it off as a separate service that's having to kind of fight for resource or fight for priority. It's kind of, in most cases, it's sort of one and the same. So if we make an improvement to the unified API, that will benefit our own products, and it will also benefit the third parties that are using it. Obviously, we have communication channels, including a sort of dedicated partnerships team that make sure that we get that information out there so that the third parties are aware of any changes that are coming. So what we mean is that, any issues that come up in the open data space are prioritised and fixed, more urgently when they're also affecting our own products. Because hands up, let's face it, when we've got our own products that we need to work on, that's where certainly my manager's focus is, and so making sure that it's part of the same thing means that we're not having to compromise there. And it's part of that virtual circle is that we also get feedback from our open data community of data issues and things that we can improve. They also sometimes provide suggestions for and opportunities for new features, although most of the kind of open data innovation does come from our in-house team. And that's sort of what I'm going to also talk about, is the fact that our product development is driving innovation in that space. So I'm going to move on and talk a little bit about TfL Go. So TfL Go is our travel app, a real-time travel app, which we launched back in 2020. And you might ask, if we're so committed to open data and if we're committed to the market, providing the market with data and letting them solve the problem, why are we doing it? So I think there are three kind of key reasons why we felt that we needed our own app. And I think the first thing is that we needed to reflect the current landscape. And back when we started doing open data, apps were quite they weren't so commonplace, and there was also a much more sort of R&D innovation space in the sort of travel sector. Where we've got to now is, I think, it's absolutely imperative. There's an expectation from all customers that that a company, and certainly London's Transport Authority, would have its own app to get information out to customers. It also gives us an opportunity to address things that perhaps aren't being managed by third-party services quite so well. So accessibility information is a really big thing for us, and obviously making sure that the network is accessible and usable by all Londoners. And we were finding that information wasn't getting out in quite the way that we were hoping, and so it helps us to have our own interface to do that. There is also the other question about the alignment of TfL's priorities, so things like around sustainable transport modes and the mayoral objectives, when you're also relying on third parties that perhaps have their own strategic ambitions, and of course perhaps a more commercial one. So it allows us to make sure that we put public transport and active travel right at the heart of the service. And then the third one is about building a digital relationship with our customers. Over time, perhaps inevitably, with the rise of apps, we have seen a slight tick down in usage of the travel tools on our website, and we think that it's really important to sort of know our customers, to be able to talk to them directly, particularly on days like today, when we've had quite major disruption, and also then to be able to kind of build that that platform by which we can perhaps spread out the messages that we're looking to share around sustainability and active travel and things like that. And without that, then our ability to influence behaviour and encourage use of the travel modes that London needs is going to be constrained. So those are the kind of reasons why we thought we'd go in for TfL Go. I think it's also worth saying that we in no way see other apps as competitors. It's something that we think complements what's out in the market. And so because of that, what we've done is focused on things that we think TfL is in a unique position to do. And at the heart of the TfL Go app is a live kind of interactive version of the GMAP. So it's sort of built in code and it's driven by data so that it can reflect live status and it can evolve over time. We've now got the ability to update that without an app change as well. So it means that things like extensions to, like, for the Elizabeth line, or there's going to be a new overground station over in Barking later this year, that we can do that without needing to update the app. We also focus very much on kind of simplicity and trying to take away some of the complexity and potentially clutter that some services have, and really just focus on sort of simple routing, glanceable real-time status. As I mentioned before, we really put accessibility at the heart of the app that we're trying to do. So we have an approach of what we call inclusive by design and inclusive by default. So it's not about kind of creating a niche accessibility app that's only for people that need to use lifts, but it's about meaning that people who do need that don't have to go searching through settings to change it. So we've got because the app the map is data driven, we've got a one-step button to change it to a step-free version, so that you can see exactly where you can interchange and where you can get down to the line if you need to use lifts. We have that detailed information about platform access, which I think has been there in sort of textual form, but it's always been quite hard to find. So that's just there in every sort of station page. And we return a step-free route in our journey planner by default. So again, you don't have to go and fiddle in settings to say you want it. And and I think there are benefits to this beyond just making it easy for people who, for example, are in a wheelchair, but also everybody occasionally needs it. So if you've got a lot of luggage, or if you're traveling with a small child and a buggy, then you don't want to have to keep switching between it. So we put it there by default. There's the inclusive design element, where we made use of the features that the apps can support. So things like dynamic type and the ability to work with voiceover or talkback, that's already provided by iOS and Android. Now, I mentioned we launched in August 2020, so that's probably familiar to people as being right slap bang in the middle of the COVID lockdown. And so, strange time in a way, and it was very much a soft launch to launch a travel app. But what we did was we both brought forward the release to start being able to get that information out to customers, and we also sort of slightly pivoted our roadmap to focus on things that could help that could help us get that information out. So the ability to give messages about what the sort of status was around masks or essential travel, a feature called quieter times I'm going to talk about later, but giving people that empowerment about when it's likely to be busier, or the other way. And we also brought walking and cycling to the fore in our journey planner where that was appropriate. Post-launch, we've done very much. So we've added buses, which was always on the roadmap, but again, with the pandemic, it became a much more prominent feature, as we saw that the use of buses continued at a higher rate than use of the tube during lockdowns. And also in 2021, we introduced the live step-free status. So that's meaning that we obviously have the knowledge of where there are lifts and how you can get from station to platform, like station entrance to platform or platform to platform. But what the live lift status does is also mean that we have like a real-time view on that, because obviously it's a bit pointless if you rely on a wheelchair to know that there's a lift in a station if it's not working. And in order to be able to deliver that feature, we actually built a graph database that brought in both the sort of topology information and the live lift status to be able to do that kind of real-time pathway finding. Following on from that, we went from the sort of typical quiet times to live busyness, which again was a key part of our sort of pandemic response. And I'm going to talk about that in more detail later, so I'm not going to go into it now. But it was a key delivery for us back in 2021. And then in 2022, this year, we've made widgets available, so you can have bounceable status widgets on both Android and iOS. And we've done a bunch of work to support the Elizabeth line, as you can imagine. And for anyone who's not familiar, it's our new railway that goes through the centre of, well, east to west through London, and it's been a long time coming, and it's been launched with a fair amount of fanfare, and what we had to do was do a fairly big map update to be able to support the Elizabeth line in the map. So there's a big redesign there, and lots of new data feeds. So why am I talking so much about our own product when this is about open data? I wanted to provide that context so that I could then show you some ways that the product development that we have has been driving open data. I think the first thing is that, as I've sort of alluded to there, a lot of the features that we released in Go have required us to either create new data sets or to improve what we already had. I'm not sure we would have ever got the business case together to do that if it wasn't our own app. So a lot of the development has been focused on the back-end services, more so than the kind of front-end delivery. And so the live set-free status is one that I've talked about, where we had to create a big data set and also a new API for the lift status. The station busyness, we've created 2 APIs, so the typical busyness that delivers quieter times and the real-time business API that delivers the live busyness feature. When we launched the Elizabeth line, it was new live arrivals data, line status data, station information all came through. Now that is one thing we'd have probably done anyway without an app, but it certainly made sure that we could also interrogate it and confirm that it's all as accurate as it needs to be. And then in Journey Planner, we also looked, as I said, about that step-free routing and also the fact that it delivers an alternative route. So that was something we wanted to do to kind of make things as clear as possible, is have 2 options. And so that's now available to third parties that are accessing our Journey Planner engine through the Open Data Service. A slightly boring one potentially, but a really, really important thing is about having how the product approach leads to better data governance. So it's probably fair to say that in the past, because we were taking that sort of literal approach of we should make data available if we got it, there was sometimes a tendency to put data up, first of all, without necessarily knowing if there was much value to it, if it was actually going to be used by the community. And then once it was there wasn't always a plan to make sure it remained up to date. And out-of-date data is obviously kind of worse than no data at all. And so making sure that we've got products that are using the data ourselves means that we kind of can define that value up front, and we can make sure that the data set that's being created to push out is one that's actually usable, and that we have that governance in place to make sure that it's going to be refreshed, and and the kind of ownership of that data is well defined up front. So I think that having the data being used in our products helps make sure that our data is managed as well as it can be. And then the third one, which I think is the really, really key point here, is that taking a UX approach to defining the data makes those data products better. And that's, again, it's sort of linked to the previous point, but it's about saying, let's not just kind of create a data set and throw it up there and hope that someone in the market can make use of it, but it's actually kind of making sure that the data is the data itself is useful, but also the way we prepare it as an API is optimized, thinking about how end applications are going to consume it. And for that, I'm going to use as a case study the real-time busyness API that we talked about earlier. So busyness is something that has always been, so we have a department at TfL called Travel Demand Management, and they're all about, kind of as it might sound, managing the kind of volumes that move through our network, particularly at times of disruption or just at sort of busy times and kind of peak times anyway. And it's something that we've always been talking to them about, is around how we get information around how busy a station, a line, a bus is. So it's something that's been talked about quite a lot. And there'd been a project ticking along for a while, led by our data and analytics team, to look at if the Wi-Fi data that we get from essentially when people go into stations that have a Wi-Fi and it hits the Wi-Fi router, it obviously sort of pings what that address is, and by anonymizing or pseudonymizing that data, so depersonalizing it, we had a data set that kind of shows how people move through the network and how many people are in a place at any one time. So there'd been some experiments, and there'd been a trial done a few years ago, but it had all been kind of like research and sort of report based. So with the pandemic, it really gave an impetus to creating a customer facing feature, releasing the data as open data so that the market could take that data and deliver that information to customers. So the work to think about a busyness algorithm anyway was already happening. Where we came in the digital team is, we saw TfL Go, or we all thought TfL Go was going to be the kind of primary interface for it. And so what that meant is that the digital team and the data and analytics team worked together to define both the customer experience of how we would present the data, and then the data itself, because ultimately we wanted to make sure that the data was being served up in the way that the app needed to consume it. And I think sometimes there's been a mistake made where the data gets created and it's like, right, here's the data, try and use it. And so what that meant was that, we made sure that so the data itself and the algorithm didn't change, but we made sure that the way that we packaged up in the API was done so that it could deliver the kind of best user experience possible. And you can see it there, both in our journey planner and in our station pages. If we then move on, we released it into open data shortly after. And again, sometimes there's a question, why don't we release it at the same time? But what it did was it meant that we could check that it was robust. So we released it into our own product. And that's another benefit, actually, that I didn't write down, is that we can kind of test the data before it goes out. And we checked the scalability was happy. We checked that it was working, and we were comfortable with, with the busyness levels that it was returning. Because the interesting thing about busyness is that it's quite subjective. And so it needed to kind of feel right. So by pushing out in our own app first, we were comfortable with it. So shortly after, we released it into open data. And those of you familiar with the Move It app will know that they basically took and integrated our data feed, and they fit it in with their approach, which is also about sort of crowdsourcing that information, and they join the two things together to fit with their product. And so that's obviously a win for them, because it's a good feature for their app, and it's also a win for us, because that means that quieter times to travel information and that empowerment in terms of providing that information to customers is is reaching more TfL customers and more people that are traveling around our network. And that's the end of my my slides. So I guess I'll hand over to Julian to see if there are any questions.
Yes, thank you, Chloe. That was really interesting, fascinating. I think it's I certainly found recently I travelled to a European capital on business, and their information was far less than you expect when you're doing work in London, and we kind of get accustomed to what's there, and it just fits our daily habits. So yes, being in a new city with with far less information was an interesting experience. Anyway, so just a quick reminder to all, if you have a question for Chloe, if you can type it into the Q&A box. We've already got a couple coming in already. If it's a question that somebody else has typed in or similar to yours, by all means press the thumbs up button, so that then means it filters up to the top, makes it easy to know which the popular questions are. But I'll just sort of start off really. But one of the things that'd be interesting to understand, Chloe, is really just how London and your approach to TfL are taking is comparing to other cities worldwide. Are you in the lead, particularly in terms of both customer passenger information, but also in terms of the approach to open data?
So I think we definitely were pioneers. That's the word that gets thrown around quite a lot. And when we first made some data available, so 2009, a big data release around 2012 to support the Olympics and the extra data we were providing there. I'm not sure there was anyone else in the world doing it. Now, please don't quote me on that because I haven't done like full research, but certainly it's something that over the years, and that my predecessors and other people that work in the data space at TfL have, had contacts from people, from all over the world and kind of other cities, wanting to kind of get information on how we have approached it. So I definitely think that we were early to the idea of open data. In terms of where we are now, I think it's probably fair to say that there is open data kind of communities, like in many places. I have to confess that I haven't, again, done lots of research to be able to kind of have that market comparison. But I know that there are, there are other cities that support this. We still get contacted, and asked for advice, not just from other transport authorities, but things in similar areas. So recently, something in terms of an authority that are doing something around the roads and motorways wanted some information about how we managed open data because they're looking to do something similar with theirs. So I think we definitely do have that reputation. And what I think we can do is we can share our successes, but I think it probably come across here is that we've obviously also made mistakes or done things which perhaps we wouldn't do if we were starting from scratch now, and so we're also very happy to kind of share that information. I think an example is until 2 years ago we didn't really have any reporting coming back from our data, so we were putting all this data out there, and apart from like kind of going out and asking third parties, are you using this data feed, we had like no idea. And so the stats that I shared from 2021, that's like the first year that we've had those stats all in one. And now the idea that you would put in place something like that and you would invest in that without a way to kind of measure the success of it, different times, I guess. But we've obviously had to kind of go back and address that when we, as an upgrade, whereas obviously you'd hope that someone starting on that journey now would put that in place from the beginning.
Yeah, and I think one of the things you also put in you mentioned there was about the development of the TfL Go app, was both triggering you generating new data sets and reevaluating what you've got. Now you could take a view that you're making this stuff open, let the market do it, you don't have any need for doing that. Well, I think it's really quite interesting that you also took the view that actually we need our own app. What were there some particular areas where people hadn't realized that the previous data feed maybe wasn't delivering what was expected or could be improved in particular ways?
So I think one of the things that we're finding right now is that the data that we have around closures of stations, or particularly when they're partially closed, so it might be only this line isn't stopping there, or that line isn't, that data isn't as good as it should be. And actually, before we had TfL Go, although if you dug down, someone could find that information on the website, it wasn't really part of a kind of everyday experience. Whereas because of our live map, because we've kind of serviced it right to the top, it became sort of glaringly obvious that this data feed that we were getting wasn't at a granular enough level for to kind of meet the customer expectations. And that's something that we had feedback a little bit like that from one of our third-party partners, but it wasn't ever given that kind of like that sort of priority, that urgency to kind of address it. It was sort of like on a list, and it didn't sound like it was that big a deal. But once it was in our own product, and I hope I'm okay to sort of share that information, suddenly it's like, this is a really high priority thing, and it's one of the sort of top things that we're looking to address with our data now. And so obviously once that's there, it will make our app better, but it will also make any third parties that are doing a live, kind of a live app kind of focused approach.
And early on in your presentation, you mentioned about the benefits being viewed as 130 million. And you mentioned also there about station closures and disruption. I mean, has any bit analysis been done in terms of how by making the information available, you're allowing passengers to alter their journeys, which therefore may mean that the disruption at a particular station actually becomes less, so you've got less of a headache. And has any analysis been done along those lines?
I have to be honest, I don't know if there's been any kind of formal analysis, but certainly that is kind of the purpose of quite a lot of what our customer information team are doing. So TDM, travel demand management, are all about that and trying to get that information out as early as possible. And so they, through our partnerships team within digital, they will make sure that the messages that they want to share reach our third parties. And I certainly think I'd call out Citymapper as an app that does a really good job of managing sort of changes to the network in advance. So people who live in London might be aware that we had a big closure of part of the Northern Line started in, getting rid of my phone, starting in January until May, where the bank branch, a big chunk of that in the centre was closed. And there was planning going on for that for like 3 years. In the event, obviously, because of the pandemic, it sort of slightly lost. It wasn't quite so high a priority as it would have been otherwise. But we did a lot of work in terms of getting that messaging out, and Citymapper did a great job of preparing it. And actually, I think anecdotally, I don't know if there's some official research, is that it was managed really well, and and people managed to find their alternative routes, or or change, I guess, their habits and maybe work from home more. I mean, interestingly, I randomly ended up on that line on the day or the day after it had reopened, and it was wonderful because it was rush hour and there was hardly anyone on it, because I think the message hadn't quite come back, but it was available again.
Yeah.
And I'm sure by now it's well, not today, but usually packed again.
Yeah. Good. Question come through from Jim. He's sort of talking about, you mentioned about getting value for money for data sets. So how do you determine or measure the value that a data set will provide?
So again, it's quite hard, particularly because we're not motivated solely by kind of cash returns, obviously. We put this data out there for free, and so we can measure it in terms of, well, a lot of it is in terms of kind of customer benefit. And so it comes down to things like, are we getting that, are we getting that message out to people? Is it helping people to make their journeys? Is it making their life easier? And then we do have things at TfL, like we have what we call the care metric, and it's basically a regular survey where we ask people if they think that TfL cares about them, and that sort of fluctuates. So I expect it will go down a bit now with the strikes, and then it goes up when we launch things. And actually it was really quite high during the pandemic because people could see the things that we were doing in terms of cleaning the network and getting that information out. So there's a bunch of things that we can do, and what we've done is we set up what we call a value framework. So it's about saying, here are the types, what are we trying to achieve with open data? And the kind of the core part of it that we score the most is around that kind of, helping customers travel. But then there are other sort of ancillary benefits, like supporting the market, the industry in London, supporting London as a city, supporting academic sort of research, and then we kind of weight it, and then you look at an initiative that comes up, and then you can kind of score it against all of those. And so some might be financial, of understanding, well, if we release this data, does it mean that we're saving money somewhere else? So there is a financial element, of course, and particularly if it means that there might be a way that if by releasing a data set, perhaps there's something that we therefore don't have to build ourselves, for example. But generally, it's these sort of softer things, but just trying to find a way to quantify that to then add up the value and make that call.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting there. So question through from Sriram, which has been voted up, is in terms of your sort of data management approach that you've used, particularly since you've now got external stakeholders, as well as that you may not necessarily know all the external stakeholders, as well as your internal stakeholders. So how have you approached sort of data governance?
How do we approach data governance? I mean, I think it's something that we're working on, definitely. It's something that we have different we have different channels that people can feedback. So we have direct relationships with some of the kind of key players that you might expect, who are obviously delivering our information to a lot of customers. And then I mentioned the tech forum as well. So quite often people will feedback issues with data through that, or any kind of issues they're having accessing or kind of using the data. So yeah, that tends to be a sort of one step removed kind of thing, but we obviously help and provide that support when it's needed. And then we do have obviously internal stakeholders, and it works both ways, because we have the stakeholders that own the data, and that's a really key one. And quite often they will want us to be putting their data out, and again, it's then managing and working out before we agree to do it, both the value of doing it, but also how we're going to make sure that it stays up to date. And then we've got the stakeholders that aren't owning the data, but they're interested in the kind of customer information angle of basically how that data will be used to deliver the kind of customer benefit. And I think I've mentioned TDM in that space as a kind of key one there. Another one would be our city planning department, who take those sort of longer term kind of policy decisions, and for them, getting kind of more of that reporting data set out there is important. So we're always having to kind of balance that. I'm not sure that totally answers the question.
No, I think it covers it quite well, but I think that it's a complex picture, and therefore you've got to have different channels getting the information in and getting people involved. And I think actually that leads quite neatly into a question from Tanya, is talking about ownership of data being better with a product-driven approach. And so she's wanting to just clarify a little bit more, or get more insights really in terms of that approach around product and data ownership. So does a product owner, for example, make decisions about the data within their product?
Give me 1 second. So I'm at the tail end of a cold and this cough is lingering. So no, I don't think the product owner or the product manager would own the data unless it was something that we had commissioned sort of directly. So actually an example where we did commission it and we sort of managed that ourselves is the step-free data set. So essentially the routes between station entrances and all the platforms, and between the platforms, and whether you need a lift or an escalator. But we'd work with our customer information team about kind of capturing that data, but in terms of owning that data set. But no, it's more about making sure that if we just have a data set and say, oh, this would be useful, let's put it up, we can do that. It's not a difficult thing, it can just go on the server. But it's about taking that sort of step back and thinking about what the process is. And I guess, as you say, it does tie in very nicely with the last one. So that, if you've got a data owner who says, I've got this data set I'd like to make, it's about working with them and understanding how often it's going to be updated, who's going to do it, how are they going to do it. How do we make sure that issues are addressed, as well as that kind of incremental or periodic updates. And yes, we could have all of those conversations, and we should and we do, even if they're just going out there. But I think actually when it's going to be driving a product that a product manager is sort of on top of, and that we'll be getting the feedback if data X isn't true. Like, for example, if we haven't updated information about docking stations for the cycle hire scheme, is something that needs to be kind of manually updated. And if we haven't done that, then obviously someone who goes to hire who goes to a docking station to hire a bike and finds that docking station doesn't exist anymore, is going to feed that back. So the product managers, it's in their interest to make sure that sort of data ownership is defined and managed.
Yeah. Also, just thinking about sort of the ownership and the governance side of things, but actually thinking more about the security and the risk implications. I mean, how do you balance making data available and open with some cases where there might be a case of you're allowing somebody who might have malicious intent the ability to do hostile reconnaissance? So there's some data, or how do you make sure you don't expose a data feed that might be, shall we say, a bit more sensitive?
So we always engage our sort of cyber security teams, excuse me again, before doing the project. So we'd make sure we engage with stakeholders, and then where appropriate, we'd also do that. And actually there is an example where we were talking about a big kind of tapped area at the moment is around what we call station wayfinding. So, particularly in those bigger stations where you've got lots of lines, you've got lots of routes, and particularly if you're trying to find the lifts as well, it's quite a complicated picture. And so there've been conversations in the past about releasing data sets which kind of map the stations basically, so that you can do so you can essentially do kind of wayfinding routes within the station itself. And one of those like raised risks that that data might be something we didn't want to share, and I think they have to take that away and look at it. So the project has been put on hold. I think I'm not 100% sure that actually they maybe looked at it and thought, oh, in the end it's not going to be a problem. But so those are the kind of examples where we need to make sure it's there. The other stuff we do, like the kind of general things like timetable data and kind of live arrival data, I think it's unlikely stuff like that is going to be used for nefarious purposes.
Yeah, but clearly you've got the consideration there, which is good to hear. Question from Glenn, who's interested in, you mentioned about the lift data and the real-time data about the lift availability, but also the fact that you used a graph database for doing that. And was there anything particular about the nature of the data that said it had to be a graph database, or was it more a question of, can we find a use to just test out whether a graph database helps us? Which was it a bit of both, maybe?
No, it was definitely the former. I think that, okay, I'm really not an expert in graph databases, and it isn't a project that I worked very closely in. But basically, the thing with the station, the kind of pathways in the station, is that there's so many kind of different combinations, and that a sort of standard sort of SQL flat database, you'd have to kind of list them all out kind of individually. But the benefits of a graph is that because you can kind of create it through the nodes and the connectors, if I can't remember it, someone's probably able to jump in and explain that properly, means that you can kind of almost create like a digital twin model that's representing both the station layout, and then that percolates out to the whole network layout and obviously we're in a happy place in when we're thinking about the kind of tube and rail network, that they're fixed assets as well. So unlike kind of the road networks, which is much more complicated, you can create that kind of digital twin view, which then means that the speed of returning of processing it, and the way of even just kind of managing it and making sure that that it's an accurate representation of the station is much easier through a graph database. And then when you then layer on top of that the live lift status, which means that it can just quickly switch that one bit off, and it affects like all of the nodes and the connectors around it, sort of instantly updating it to reflect it. So I probably waffled a little bit there, but that's there was definitely, when we looked at the fact that we wanted to create this this data set that allowed for live step-free routing and step-free access, that there was a need for a graph database, and we had to go through a proof of concept and then a big old procurement, so we wouldn't have done it for the sake of it. One of the questions we've then had is, how do we how or should we extend use of the graph database now we've kind of got it? And interestingly, some of the feedback that comes out from some of the devs is, but let's not do it for the sake of it, because there are extra complexities, and there are things that like a kind of standard SQL database is more appropriate for. So let's not just use it for everything. So we're being, well, certainly I'm being led by the experts on that one.
Yeah, it sounds like you've got quite a clued up, capable team there. Question from Ashok, which I think is also an interesting one to consider, is sort of whether you're working with other UK cities about their open data, and maybe looking at agreeing, is there a standard way of, for example, bus data, of making sure that bus data is available and comparable, or whether it's the underground in Liverpool or Glasgow or whatever, you've got comparable ways of using the information. Have you got relationships with the other transport providers?
So we certainly have informal relationships with them, and yes, similarly we've had conversations with various transport operators in different parts of the UK, where they've been asking for advice about how we've done our open data, and actually advice about apps and TfL Go as well. Actually, it's interesting you picked out bus data, because actually there's a DFT led initiative called BODS, the bus open data system or service,
Okay.
not sure which one, that mandates the bus companies for DfT controlled areas, which funnily enough isn't London, but we sort of voluntarily are part of that. And so one of the big drivers was a couple of years ago, there was something called to do live bus location. So basically for all the buses that are out on the network, that they will come into this system, so that obviously then helps the real time and it's all in a consistent form. And so we created the feed to deliver that into the BODs and in the format that they needed it. And that's an example kind of almost contrary to what I was just explaining about the product development led approach to open data. That was one we had because we had a kind of regulatory obligation to do it. But what it has done is now we've got that data set, it's something that we're looking to see how we can implement it into TfL Go. So that's one where we've taken like the opposite approach. We wouldn't usually create a data set for the sake of it, but because it's there and it is actually a really valuable data set, once it's there and working, we kind of see it being part of, please don't quote me on this, I've got no timelines, but we see it as something that will probably come into TfL Go in the future.
Interesting. And what else do you think? I mean, giving us sneak previews of what's in the pipeline that might be coming in the future. Are you able to share anything of what your future plans are?
For TfL Go and for open data. So the focus for TfL Go for the future is to, for the short-term future is to make sure that we kind of meet all of those sort of hygiene features. We're obviously quite late to market in an app, and so we've had to kind of prioritize and we've had to focus on things that we think are kind of most important. But it means that there's a bunch of things that you'd expect a London travel app to have that we don't yet, and particularly one that's that's run by ourselves. So I don't think it's going to be any spoilers, but I'd hope that it's not going to be kind of all published. So we need to do some more stuff around buses, and we need to do stuff with the other modes. So active travel's a big thing on our agenda as well. And then the other thing that we're looking at is at the moment we've got an easily configurable app. So things like the one-stop pressed button to turn on the set free version of the map, for example. But at the moment it isn't sort of personalized in any way. And so that's a theme that we'll see coming through at some point around being able to kind of get more tailored information out to our customers. And we have a TfL ID account that was integrated for the Oyster service and contactless, and so that's the kind of foundations for us being able to have that that kind of more direct digital relationship, and and sort of really build on that. No timelines.
No timelines, yeah. No, that's really interesting. So we're sort of approaching the end of our time slot. So just a final question really for you, Chloe. Just thinking about anybody who might either be wanting to get into a career in open data, maybe get into the team over at TfL. What are your thoughts there about routes to get in if somebody's maybe got different backgrounds, different experiences, what qualifications, what skills are relevant to get into a career in open data?
So I think, if it's about using the open data and, creating an app, and I believe that's how Citymapper started, was someone just took our open data and it was buses originally, I think, then I'd say get in there and sort of play with it. You can register, we need you to register to access the unified API, but there's no fee involved, and then you can access it, and there's documentation. Another learning is sometimes our documentation isn't perhaps as good as it should be, and that's something we're looking to improve. But as I say, we've got the tech forum as well. So I think there's definitely getting in there, and we have a data outreach team who also kind of run things with like education establishments, so getting schools and then universities involved in kind of using the open data. So there are some sort of routes through that. In terms of wanting to work at TfL, I do a call out. We always need good developers. I'm not a developer myself, and so don't know exactly what sort of tech stack you need to be familiar with, but there's pretty much always open jobs going in our team, because not just within the open data space, but across the piece. What we don't have is a dedicated open data development team because of that approach where it's the unified API. What we have is a team that would so you'd be joining a team that would be working on back-end services and data services that would be driven by the needs. So so that might be a feature that's going to go into TfL Go, and also obviously go into, because it's going via the unified API, there'd be a kind of a public kind of flavor of it, or it might be something that like the BODS work we did for buses, which is driven just by the API. But what we wouldn't have is someone working purely on open data. We do have, though, a few. There's none open at the moment, but we have partnerships people, if you're interested on the kind of non-technical side of and how we kind of keep that community kind of ticking over. So that's another route, I guess.
Oh, that's good. So it sounds like there's lots of routes, lots of opportunities there. So that's really good. So so I think time's up. So thank you for that presentation, Chloe. It's been really, really insightful. I think it's a really good demonstration of an organization that is using open data really well. And I think it's really interesting that quite a hybrid approach you mentioned there, of how it's not a separate team, separate department, it's very much part of what you do. And I think it's going to be really interesting to see where things go to in the future. So thank you for your presentation, Chloe. Thank you for the answers you've given in the Q&A session. So it's much appreciated. So thank you once and all, and thank you all for attending, and join us for the rest of the week at some of our other sessions if you're interested.
Thanks for having me. Bye-bye.